From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. As I always say, thank you very much not only for joining us, but thank you very much for subscribing. If you're not subscribing already, please make sure you do at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your listening. And please, of course, leave us a nice review. This week, we have the almost legislated, put into law, the One Big Beautiful Bill. Of course, this is the signature piece of domestic legislation for President Trump and the Republican Party. Passed the Senate. The Senate passed its version this week. Somewhat different from the House version that passed a couple of weeks ago, but not dramatically or significantly different. As I record this now on Wednesday morning, it's back before the House. The House is expected to vote pretty soon. And while there are still some Republican opponents in the House where there's a small Republican majority casting some doubt on the outcome, I think we can probably be fairly confident that this measure, as I say, the signature measure of Donald Trump's second term, domestic policy measure of his second term, is very likely to emerge in something like the form that the Senate has passed. That is, of course, as you know, essentially the centerpiece of it is the extension of the 2017 tax cuts that the Republicans passed in Donald Trump's first term, that significant tax cuts, both in personal income tax rates, but of course in corporate tax rates. So those were due to expire. They, as a result of this measure, assuming it's passed, will be extended now, not essentially indefinitely. Obviously, the other key elements of this measure, one set of important elements, at least in political terms, were measures to keep the president's promise that he made on the campaign trail to eliminate taxes on tips and overtime and some various other things that he'd promised. Fiscally, they're relatively unimportant in the overall picture, but politically they were quite significant. The other sort of big element of the package of a bill that passed the Senate are some fairly significant cuts in spending, particularly in Medicaid, or at least cuts to the growth in spending on Medicaid, which has got some Republicans rather alarmed. Tom Tillis, the Republican senator from North Carolina, opposed the bill. And of course, actually, after he was criticized and targeted by President Trump, announced he was actually going to stand down from his North Carolina seat in next year's election. Opposed the bill for a number of reasons, but particularly on the concerns about Medicaid and the effect that it might have on the indigent. There are various estimates as to how much the effect the bill would have in terms of people who would lose medical coverage or lose benefits. But it could be in the millions. It could be significant. Republicans argue this is really important. It's retargeting Medicaid to those who really are the most needy, the people who are really the most deserving. But there are some political concerns, as I said, as reflected by Tom Tillis and some others, and we'll see what the impact of that may be. And the third big element of the bill, of course, is that it does overall increase, once again, America's debt. We had an increase in the debt ceiling included in the bill. Congressional Budget Office estimates that the effect of the bill is to add another $3.2 trillion to the federal debt over the next 10 years or so. That's obviously in addition to the expected increase in the debt that we were seeing. So we're looking at potentially in the range of $60 trillion worth of debt. You know, as they say, $60 trillion here and $60 trillion here, and pretty soon we're talking serious money. That does have a lot of people alarmed. Some Republicans reject the CBO's analysis and numbers and say, no, actually the effect of the bill on economic growth will be to significantly reduce that effect on the deficit and the debt. But I think most people probably would say that's uncertain. And the one certainty that seems to have been a feature of US fiscal policy for the last 20 plus years is that the debt will just keep on rising. Debt interest will consume more and more of government spending. And we continue to defer the day of reckoning to whenever the US is actually going to deal with that issue. So we have the bill. We're very likely to have that bill out of the House and the act signed into law pretty soon by the president. So this week I wanted to dig into it, look at the implications, what it means, not only for America's fiscal outlook, obviously importantly, but for America's economy, but also to look at the politics of it and what it tells us about President Trump's second term, where the Republican Party is going, and more broadly, how domestic politics may unfold in the course of the next couple of years. And I'm delighted to say to do that, I'm joined by a genuine expert on all matters fiscal. That's Doug Holtz-Eakin. an old friend, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, former economics professor, and now someone who spends his life, luckily for him, immersing himself in the data of fiscal matters. And as I say, I can't think of anybody better to take us through this, to explain both what the bill amounts to, but also to explore the implications. And so delighted to say that Doug Holtz-Eakin joins me now. Doug, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
My pleasure.
So, as I said in my introductory remarks, we've seen the Senate this week pass the big, beautiful bill back to the House now. We can talk a little bit about its sort of political prospects, but I wanted to sort of dig into the detail with you, as I can't think of anybody better equipped and more experienced to talk about it. It is an enormous bill. Whether you think it's beautiful or not, it's enormously important in terms of its tax provisions.
Sure.
Very significant spending cuts. Again, we can talk about to what extent it does contribute to the debt, but it surely does, at least in some respects. So just give us your overall take. That bill that passed the Senate, again, at this point, we're recording this Wednesday morning. We don't quite know yet what will emerge from the House, whether it will just get cleaned through. But tell us what your impression is of the bill that passed the Senate.
Well, I think there are two outstanding virtues. Virtue number one is that it exists, and we're not going to have a sunset of the 2017 law, which would have been a $425 billion tax increase next year, almost certainly a recession. Avoiding that was an imperative. Second great virtue is that it raises the debt ceiling without any financial market volatility, no showdowns. We haven't seen that in a while. That's a good thing. That movie's not a good one for the United States. Past that, the tax policy really falls in three buckets. The bulk of it is extension of current law. Most people expected current law to be extended, so that's not an event. It's not going to do anything for growth. It's more of the same. Second piece are some genuinely good investment incentives, permanent expensing of equipment investment, R&D, 4 years of some structures, all valuable pro-growth policy, the best part of the bill in my view. And then the remainder are these payoffs of political promises on the campaign trail. No taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, bigger deduction of state and local taxes, exemptions for seniors, those things, which I think are collectively of little genuine tax policy value, aren't going to do anything for growth. And so on the whole, as an economic policy, this is really addition by subtraction. No debt ceiling showdown, no tax increase, but it's not really a pro-growth tax reform. It's a pale imitation of the 2017 Act.
Let's just look at some of the details then. And let's start on the spending side. Perhaps the most controversial, and certainly the most controversial in terms of passage in the Senate, were the cuts to Medicaid, or I should say more strictly, the cuts to the growth of Medicaid, if you like. We should be careful about our terminology. And there's different disagreement about how many people will lose, depending on how the states allocate the money. And there's different estimates of how many people will lose Medicaid coverage, anywhere between 2 and 3 million and 10 million, according to who you believe. We saw Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, very vocally opposing the bill on the grounds that it would devastate Medicaid in his state. What's your assessment of that? The defenders say no work requirements. It retargets Medicaid to where it was supposed to be, on the genuinely needy. It incentivizes people to return to work. Where do you stand on that?
If we had done this in another setting, if we had a sort of standalone Medicaid reform and asked the question, what do we want to do with Medicaid in the 21st century? I think we'd have done a lot of things, including put a real limit on these provider taxes, which are, quite frankly, just a financial gimmick that allows states to pull federal taxpayer money into their budgets. And they're not of any virtue. They should go away. I think a bipartisan group would have made them go away as part of Medicaid reform. So I think the hysteria is somewhat overblown. Medicaid is no longer what it once was. It was supposed to be a targeted program for low-income Americans. It was supposed to be one where we really paid attention to single mothers and their children. The Affordable Care Act turned it into another path to universal coverage. The disparities in reimbursements between mothers and single males don't make any sense. So this is a partial reform of Medicaid. We're going to need a bigger reform of Medicaid. We're going to need a bigger reform of all the entitlements. So I find it a little hard to get quite as worked up about this as some people.
So you think it's not right then that, as Tillis and others have said, that this could result, exactly as you said, in essentially the loss of health insurance for millions of people? Is that an exaggeration?
I have no doubt that we are going to reduce the money spent by the federal government on Medicaid. How the states will react, what they will do with their programs in the absence of this sort of implicit match from the provider tax is hard to say. I can't rule out the fact that some people will lose their Medicaid, but let's hope that the states do their jobs and say, okay, where do we want to target scarce government dollars in supporting healthcare and make sure that those who need the insurance policies the most get them? That's the right way to think about it.
Again, look at the tax cut. You already talked about that, about the tax cut, or rather largely the extension of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax rates and schedules. Again, looked at from the point of view, I want to come on to the particular fiscal implications of all this in a minute, but looked at from the point of view of tax policies, it should be, incentivizing work, incentivizing entrepreneurship, frankly, giving, in good conservative principle of giving people more money rather than having them taken away. You talked about the gimmicks, as you referred to them, taxes on tips and overtime and things like that. But the broad tax measures, again, both the individual and the corporate tax measures, you agree that they essentially should be beneficial to the economy in the short and medium term?
I think the 2017 Act was a tremendous reform. Not perfect, but great simplification, very much an important business tax reform. We used to lose 5 headquarters a year to inversions. That stopped immediately with the 17 Act. Preserving all that, extending all that is a good thing. No question about it. The economy will benefit. My hope had been they would do even more. I think they could have cleaned up tremendously the pass-through taxation, which was the real anti-simplification that came out of 17. That's the place where they did the least well. You could have done that. You could have made all of these investment incentives permanent from the outset and really had a stronger bill. We didn't do that. And I think if you're going to not improve the fiscal outlook, the lower bound should be that you have a pro-growth tax reform. And this is a modestly pro-growth reform, and it makes the fiscal situation worse. So that's not a trade-off I love.
Again, you mentioned the debt ceiling and how important it is to again, we're not going to go through one of those traumatic moments where Moody's downgrades the US debt and everything else. We've got that clean, $5 trillion increase in the debt ceiling, I think it was. Again, there are a lot of conservatives, understandably, who are very unhappy about that. Most of them ended up, of course, voting for it. But I take your point that it's better to do it this way rather than to get into one of these protracted and tense debates about it. But is this these continuing sort of clean increases in the debt limits? Conservatives used to oppose them. Now we seem to regard them as kind of more or less, de rigueur. That's not a healthy thing, is it?
The amount of debt that we have is not a healthy thing. The underlying problem here is the failure to control deficits and large increases in the debt. Something that we really just haven't done in the 21st century for reasons that I think are quite troubling. In the 20th century, we were pretty disciplined. Deficits averaged 2.2% of GDP. 21st century, it's over 5. We entered the century with 30% debt to GDP, and we're now over 100 and headed well north. So there's nothing good to be said about the management of federal finances in the 21st century. And it's happened on the watch of both Republicans and Democrats. This is an abject national failure, and this bill doesn't reverse that. It didn't create it. I think it's overblown what people are saying about how this is the debt problem. It embraced the underlying problem. That's not good. We have an underlying problem we should fix. And we're seeing that in debt ceiling increases, but those are the results of the underlying failure to control our finances.
Where do you stand on the direct fiscal impact of this bill? We saw the CBO, I think, come up with that revised estimate of a $3.2 trillion 10-year addition to the debt. I know there's a lot, again, people disagree with that. Dynamic scoring and, a lot of Republicans in particular think that the impact will be less than that. Where do you stand on that?
I have no reason to question those numbers. I ran the CBO. I'm a supporter of the professionalism that they display in doing this. I don't think there are going to be great growth impacts of this particular legislation. So the dynamic and static scores are very close to the same. This is going to increase the debt, no question. But the real problem is that it didn't more aggressively try to reduce future deficits, and that was never on the table. And so that to me is the real disappointment.
That's the $36 trillion question, or the $60 trillion whatever we get to at the end of this 10-year period in terms of the debt. What would you do? I mean, again, if you waved a wand and you were king and you're not just running the CBO anymore, but you're actually able to really identify how to restore the US federal finances to some sort of equilibrium, where would you start?
There are 2 reasons why the debt has gone up in the 21st century. One is we've had great emergencies. We've had pandemic, we had Great Recession. But the difference between this century and the previous one is, we had World War II, we had Korean Wars, we had emergencies in the 20th century, but Congress's and administrations cleaned up afterwards. They got the debt back down. We haven't done that in this century. It goes up, it stays up. And the second is we have the underlying structural deficit that comes from the rapidly growing entitlement programs and the fact that they are the bulk of spending. The real truth about this bill is Social Security and Medicare are off limits, Those two programs alone are more than one half of all non-interest spending over the next 10 years. They're off the table. They're growing more rapidly than everything else. 5.5% per year in Social Security, 7 to 7.5% in Medicare. Revenues are going to grow at 4.5% at best, the nominal economy. So those huge programs are outstripping the revenues that support them, and that's why we have big deficits. And we're not talking about those, we're not addressing those. And that's what needs to happen.
And just, again, I don't want to dig too deep into the future of Social Security and Medicare here, but I mean, I know there is an argument I've heard from some Democrats say that actually with relatively small tweaks, Social Security in particular, Medicare does pose a whole set of different problems because the path of medical spending is probably much less predictable, even allowing for the knowledge we have about the demographics. But we can be pretty reasonably confident about estimates of the Social Security obligations, and that with relatively small tweaks, maybe raising the retirement age again, maybe a degree of means testing, very controversially perhaps, adding some contributions, whatever. I mean, well, you tell me, do those programs need a radical overhaul, or can we make relatively small adjustments that could keep them solvent and, more importantly, could help us address the larger fiscal problems over the next 20 years?
I certainly think we can take the same basic structure of Social Security and make it reforms to the benefit side. And I'm probably going to have to raise some revenue by raising the cap on the payroll tax, for example, and put our house in order and reduce the red ink in the overall federal budget. The frustrating thing for me is to hear Democrats say, with minor tweaks, we can fix it, but they won't.
Right.
So, let's get on with it. The trust fund's going to exhaust in 8 years. So if you think about it, if you're 55 and you want to retire at 65, you don't know what your benefit's going to be. That's a terrible way to run a pension program. It is well past time for Democrats and Republicans to take on the program, make it financially sustainable in whatever form, and let people know what the deal is. That's what a good program would do.
We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Doug Holtz-Eakin. We're talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And in the next segment, I want to explore especially the broad political questions that arise from this, what this measure tells us about where the Republican Party's priorities are and where the country's political priorities are. So stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Doug Holtz-Eakin, former director of the Congressional Budget Office. Of course, we're talking about fiscal policy, and in particular, the big, beautiful bill that has been passed by the Senate and seems to be on the brink of being passed by the House of Representatives. Question, Doug, again, you're very familiar with the dynamics of the way Congress works. One thing that has been controversial about the process in the Senate was the way in which Republican majority Democrats would say, change the rules about accounting for the fiscal effect of these measures, essentially, beyond the 10-year horizon, counting them as, again, as some people call it, free. Again, whatever the merits of that particular case, one of the things that strikes me about this is that this is one of those things that these things seem to have a ratchet effect, right? It was like when Harry Reid famously did away with the filibuster for judicial nominees, and everybody warned him, well, you're doing it now, you Democrats are in the majority, but the Republicans are going to come and do that. This strikes me as very similar to that. The Republicans can waive the rules, change the rules on this for what things they want to do now. One day, presumably, we're going to have Democrats in control of the Senate again, and they're going to do the same thing. And it is this kind of ratchet effect, isn't it, where we can't ever get back to some sort of normality or fiscal rules. Yeah,
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I am no fan of the current law baseline, which in fact has an asymmetric discrimination against tax cuts and favors spending. But we know what it is. It's written down in statute. Anyone knows how to construct it. To do this on the fly and set this precedent allows the Democrats to sort of cook up whatever they want as, quote, current policy baseline in a future Reconciliation Act. That's a precedent I would not have set. I think it's a dangerous one for exactly the reasons you described.
This is a very much a moving target. We are recording this on Wednesday morning. The House, and again, I'm not asking you to sort of handicap what's going to happen in the House. And again, because of the parliamentary rules, it's got to be a pretty straightforward process. Do you think that essentially the Senate bill, one form or another, is basically now going to be the law? Is that what we can expect? I mean, I don't want to be blasé about this. I know there are Republicans in the House who are very unhappy, and with a 5-seat majority, whatever it is, that could be important. But is the Senate bill going to be what this final act is going to look like?
I certainly think so. What I would expect to happen, that there will be Republicans who are unhappy with the bill and will voice their displeasure. The fiscal conservatives are going to say there's not enough spending cuts. The SALT caucus is going to say that it's not generous enough. And they may even slow the passage considerably to make sure the folks back home know that they were doing their job. But in the end, they're going to vote yes. And this bill is going to go to the president for signature.
me just ask you almost a larger political question here. What are we to make of this? Again, this is big, beautiful bill. This is the signature legislation, almost certainly, of the Trump second term. We'll see. Maybe something else will come up, but it seems pretty unlikely. It's the first 6 months of the Trump second term. I wonder how we should think about it, how you would sort of characterize it. A lot of the measures are classic, conservative fiscal approach. The significant tax cuts again, or that's terminology, right? Maintaining the tax cuts that were implemented in 2017. Again, both on the personal side and on the corporate side. Some relatively significant cuts to spending, to welfare spending, in particular with Medicaid. So it looks like for all the kind of talk about the Trump revolution and how Trump may be different and populism, and we hear people like JD Vance and Josh Hawley talking about a kind of a new kind of Republican Party. It feels and looks like, doesn't it, a pretty kind of classic Republican fiscal measure for the most part. Would you agree with that?
2 of the 3 buckets of policy are traditional conservative stuff. I mean, you've got the spending stuff. You have the 17 Act plus the additional investment incentives, which are making permanent things that were in the original act. That's traditional conservative stuff. It's the populist, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, things that are departures from that norm. That wasn't in the 17 Act. Wouldn't have been in a traditional conservatives list of things to get done.
And again, to be fair, those are, while symbolically important, and certainly in terms of, the president keeping his promises that he made on the campaign trail, in fiscal terms, they're pretty negligible, aren't they?
Yeah. They're nothing for me to get excited about, and what I worry about is not their existence, but I worry about them becoming tax extenders, that in fact we will get up against the point where they start to sunset and we'll have to extend the no tax on tips, extend the no tax on overtime. And those are things which are at odds with the basic notion that you want to broaden the base, treat income similarly, and get rates down as far as possible. This goes the other way. And so it gets in the way of future tax reforms if we have to adhere to them.
And finally, Doug, what do you think of it in terms of its political impact? I was talking to someone the other day. I think one of the reasons it's kind of perhaps a harder sell politically for the Republicans is, again, the largest part of this is maintaining tax rates that are already there. So it's, we call it a tax cut, and of course it is a tax cut relative to where tax rates would have gone. But it's basically maintaining the status quo with, as you say, these little sort of bells and whistles of tips and overtime and that kind of stuff, while the new thing is potentially some cuts to Medicaid. And so while we can all agree that maintaining those tax rates was very important, and it would have been a disaster if we hadn't got a measure through by the end of this year and we'd have seen this huge increase in taxes. It's kind of hard to sell that as a tax cut, particularly. And at the same time, you do have some spending cuts. How do you expect to see this? I mean, Democrats seem to be very eager to run on it. We've heard the warnings of people like Tom Tillis. How do you see its political impact?
I think it is a harder sell than, for example, the 17 Act. No question about it. The president was elected, in my view, to deliver better economic results, more stable and rapid growth in the standard of living and low and stable inflation. And that would be perceived as a change from what had preceded him with the Biden administration. And the vehicle for accomplishing this change is to not change anything, to continue doing the same thing. So that's a tough piece of politics. So I think getting it done early has been a priority for a reason. They can now let the economy deliver good results and run on the results, not on the bill. And that would be the right outcome.
Doug Holtz-Eakin, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, economist, commentator on all things economic and fiscal. Thanks very much indeed for illuminating our understanding of the bill. And thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression. I will be back next week. In the meantime, have a wonderful 4th of July holiday, a very happy 4th of July Independence Day to all of you. Hope you managed to get a break and a rest and to celebrate this country and this great country and its independence and see what can bring us all together. In the meantime, as I say, have a great week, have a great holiday weekend, and I'll see you next week.